Okay, Sam Hammond, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So Peter Thiel said that crypto is decentralizing and AI is centralizing. Crypto is libertarian, AI is communist. Was he right?
It sort of remains to be seen. I think there's, clearly you can understand the intuition behind that. The Chinese Communist Party uses artificial intelligence and digitization more generally to surveil their population, to control social media, to censor people. And, if you think to like 1984 and Big Brother watching, the question was always, okay, how do they have as many people watching the people being watched? And with artificial intelligence, you sort of solve that problem. Conversely, crypto, is decentralized money. If money is like the heart and soul of government, then decentralizing that should decentralize governments. I think it's more. I think the story is more complicated.
Yeah, for what it's worth, somehow I feel like the crypto part of that claim feels less important for how the future goes. Maybe I'll be shown wrong. You have a series of posts on something like AGI and Leviathan.
Mhm.
Can you tell a story in those posts about something like your default story, what happens to, let's say, US institutions, liberal democratic institutions, from, roughly now, or I suppose a couple of years ago at the point you're writing, through to 2030 and beyond? Just take me through that story. What's happening, the next few years to begin with?
Yeah, so maybe I can just back up a tiny bit and explain the motivation for that series. It is addressing this question that Thiel raises, and I tend to think that governments, like corporations, exist for a common reason, namely to internalize transaction costs. If we didn't have transaction costs, if there wasn't a cost to contracting, to principals monitoring their agents, and so on and so forth, there wasn't asymmetric information, we wouldn't need governments. We also wouldn't need corporations. We would just all be in some spot market contracting with each other. That's not the world we live in. And so we have corporations, and corporations are like these vertically integrated things that bring people under one roof so they can produce together, and so they can have better monitoring, better supervision, better planning, and governments do very similar things. So the question is, how does AI affect transaction costs? And I think it's pretty clear that if you have, a conditional on like alignment, very powerful AI systems that are, as good or better than humans at most things, but also can work day and night, are aligned, like literally aligned, so you don't have the principal agent problem. They do what you ask and understand your intent. Then transaction costs fall dramatically. And so there's these kind of these two forces that are cutting against each other. On the one hand, we already alluded to the ways in which AI can be centralizing, but at first brush, the econ analysis would suggest that collapsing transaction costs should reduce the economies from vertically integrating everything under one roof, and that we should enable kind of thousand flowers to bloom. And when I look at the way institutions have evolved to date, we kind of have different countries, different regimes starting from different starting points, right? And I think the way the nation state evolves post-AGI will be very sensitive to those initial conditions. So I can totally see a world where China, given its existing sort of initial condition, evolves even more deeply into locking in a kind of all-seeing Leviathan. And that's where the name of those essay series came from. Conversely, there's another world where in the West, governments are slow to adopt AI, both congenitally because bureaucracies are slow, but then also because we have a variety of civil rights, civil liberties, constitutions, procedures, things that constrain government's ability to adopt certain technologies. And nevertheless, there's a demand for things like surveillance. There's a demand for things like contract enforcement, that if government fails to provide that, either because of bureaucracy or because they literally have their hands tied, that gets pushed off into private organizations. And so I sort of see us on this knife edge where some more, autocratic regimes will become even more autocratic, more locked in. And in the West, our weaker states, our constrained states, will fail to adapt fast enough and push a lot of these core government functions off into the private sector. Where I don't just mean corporations, I mean gated communities, I mean sort of a neo-feudal kind of equilibrium.
Yeah, there's this idea of the narrow corridor, Shimoglu and others, right? Where, okay, on one hand, you have something like autocracy. On the other hand, you have something like anarchy. And the challenge for a democratic state is to avoid collapsing into either side.
Right.
And does that map on to what you're saying, where currently we have these states which are, walking some line there, and they are liable to collapse in one direction or another once we get AGI?
Yeah, precisely. I don't endorse everything in their book, The Narrow Corridor, but I think that basic framing is quite useful. And part of this came from my own, upbringing as a young libertarian, where we're taught to dislike the state. And as I learned more about the origin of the state, the origin of classical liberalism, it's actually what countered that simplistic narrative. It actually, in some ways, the classical era was an era of very strong states. These were the first states that consolidated tax collection and had the kind of state capacity to enforce contract and property rights and things that otherwise would be unenforceable. And so there is this balancing act to a free and open society where you need strong institutions in some verticals to maintain the kind of open order, extended order around it.
I wonder if another angle is you need that monopoly on violence aspect, both for security reasons, but also just for providing public goods.
I think where we're coming from, in the United States is a place that has very uneven state capacity, but we also, we aren't anarchy. That we'll see a continuation of the trend that we've already seen since the 50s, which is a progressive ability for private actors to actually provide public goods that once were only the remit of the state. Right. So, we have SpaceX doing an Apollo program. We have Palantir building basically the tech stack for the CIA and for NSA. And, I think this is going to, that trend will only accelerate as AI unlocks totally new paradigms that more nimble, dynamic companies will be able to adopt and scale up in the same way that, the internet did this in micro with, Uber and Lyft is like a classic example I talk about, displacing taxi commissions, but also broader things like, Google Maps, Google Search. I think these are global public goods in some ways that are paid not through tax collection, but the skimming off the top of AdSense revenue.
Yeah, all those examples you mentioned, Uber replacing taxis, SpaceX replacing the kind of publicly administered engineering, they're examples of the private sector improving on what came before. For the most part, SpaceX is just wildly more efficient than what it replaced. So you're not presumably presenting this as a reason just to be kind of worried or something. But when does that privatization force go wrong? Why is it something to worry about at all?
For several reasons. One, and I don't want to prejudge that it's necessarily bad. Obviously Uber and Lyft are much better. I think Amazon is better than the U.S. Postal Service.
Did you see this poll? U.S. institutions ranked by public.
And Amazon's number
trust
one
and opinion
above the military.
Yeah.
And I've said this. I'm Canadian. I joke that Canada. I believe Canada is a far superior system of government. On philosophical and empirical grounds. But I would trade that for same day shipping any day of the week.
Yeah.
So I think there's a deep continuity between all these trends and the broader digital transformation. So on the one hand, the things I'm talking about are familiar. On the other, I think there's also a difference in kind, sort of more as different phenomena where, there are these sort of core government functions that we think about that aren't things like the space program. The space program is a sort of completely ancillary, project what happens when AI begins to, when we have AI lawyers, AI judges that are able to do the sort of firmware level thing of manage and maintain a legal system, and how does our existing legal system adapt to that? Right? These sort of firmware level properties of government then become implicated, including the machinery government itself, like the actual bureaucracies themselves. And that's where I think you end up sort of having the Uber and Lyft, but for everything, for these core government functions that looks a lot more like a regime change in macro. And the thing that emerges on the other end of that could be very good. I think it will also just be a very rocky transition that people aren't ready for, and it should at the very least, enter into our political strategies or advocacy strategies. Like if you're an AI safety researcher or advocate and you think that we need to have some body in the US government that is monitoring frontier AI, and you think that the real scary stuff kicks off in the 2030s or something like that, you have to be aware that the agency or committee or whatever that you installed through your advocacy might not exist anymore, or might not have the power you think it has. And then there's a secondary thing, which I think plays out in the longer run. If it's physically possible to build an AI system that kills everybody, and you need some kind of global coordination to prevent that, this broader trend is a trend towards a much more adversarial, competitive world, one where, in some ways, coordination gets harder because we're splintering and balkanizing.
I see. Yeah. Do you have more examples in mind of the more core government functions getting privatized or outsourced? For example, I don't know what to imagine when I try to imagine an Uber for the FDA of some regulatory or enforcement agency, right? Like, just by law, you can't replace them by some private alternative. So,
yeah, I mean, there's a great book by Ed Stringham on my bookshelf over here called Private Governance, where he talks about many examples from the past. And, part of my perspective is that there's been this U-shaped curve in historical development, where a lot of things that used to be, that are today, we think of as purely government functions, were in the past run through private associations and membership organizations, things like that. Like the New York Stock Exchange, for instance, began as a private association. Today, most security is not provided by public police forces, but by private security forces. And that U-shaped curve sort of arises from the fact that, like, there's some parallels between having a very high transaction cost world and a very low transaction cost world, where if it's very hard to, you need some minimal level of organization to build a state. But if it becomes very, very easy to organize at a very local level, then that starts to wither away. There's a kind of continuity or kind of ISO curve depending on like your relative state capacity. So countries that have really, really weak state capacity already have a lot more privatized policing. If you've ever driven through like favelas in Brazil or something like that, there's a lot of gated communities with their own security forces. So we start to see some of this already playing out now with artificial intelligence, where there's companies like Flock, which are privatizing surveillance for local law enforcement. There's a more decentralized approach to this, where Ring, the Ring camera company, at their keynote, they did this big keynote this year where they unveiled a new technology where everyone in your local community that has a Ring camera, if someone, say, loses a dog, their dog gets lost, they can upload a picture of that dog, and if people have opted in, it can use its multimodal capabilities to scan everyone's Ring camera to try to identify where that dog went running. Then you can sort of roll that forward and think, well, at some point, maybe there will be proprietary databases of people with criminal records or people that were known to have undesirable qualities. And if they enter your neighborhood, like a package thief or something like that, you harness that hive mind to do the enforcement for you.
Yeah, one dynamic here might be the entrenched interest trying to resist this change. So the taxi commissions tried, and with some success, to resist or carve out some relevance when Lyft sharing apps, ride sharing apps came along. I don't know, how relevant is that kind of force where the groups with entrenched power now are just really try to kind of hold back that change?
I mean, the reason we have things like occupational licensing or educational certificates is precisely to economize on a certain asymmetry of information. We have some body of known experts that then qualifies this person to be the surgeon or something like that. Now, this is why Uber and Lyft, the displacement was so rapid, because with modern information technology, you suddenly and if everyone having a smartphone in their pocket, we had these new mechanisms for closing that information asymmetry, reputation rankings, things along those lines, matching systems. And it just turned out to be a much more efficient way of doing things. And when that efficiency delta is large enough, you end up having this kind of, institutional gradient descent where there's very strong pressures to move in that direction. Within the case of Uber, things move quickly in part because the enforcement is relatively decentralized, and so there was a weakest link phenomena. They could aggressively move into a local market and sort of, not ask for permission, ask for forgiveness, and then once everyone was bought in, it became hard to ban them because the consumer would be upset. I think there's other areas where the monopoly power is more, more of a choke point, like the dock workers. We already have countries that have fully automated freight and port systems, so it's not even requiring new technology. We could have the Koreans come over and build the port of LA into a fully automated port, but it's the fact that they control that choke point that makes it very difficult. There's a kind of jagged frontier of intelligence, and there's, I think, going to be a jagged frontier in how AI diffuses because of these existing constraints. So, we're going to have a software singularity before we have a robotics singularity, before we have fully automated nursing homes or whatever. It'll still move more quickly than people realize for several reasons. One, there are often ways to end run existing systems, right? So, we have this thing called the FDA, which regulates drugs, and it's super small c conservative and slows things down. But then we also have medical tourism. We have, gray market Chinese peptides. We have, states of right to try laws. And I think all that sort of gets turned up to 11 as, if there are life-changing, life-altering technologies that are sitting in some pipeline. Then we have the phenomena that a lot of AI is just very direct to consumer. So you could say, well, a lot of people are using AI as a therapist, and there's evidence that it might even be a really good psychotherapist. But won't the psychotherapist guilds try to ban that? And indeed, in some states like Illinois, they have banned AI for psychotherapy. But there's no way to actually keep the genie in the bottle. If I'm pretty sure if I'm in Illinois, I can still just use ChatGPT as my therapist, and no one's going to stop me.
What you're really picturing, when things start to heat up, AI-wise, what is happening to, for the sake of focus, the US and its political institutions on, your mainline story, and then just how, I don't know, like how worried do you feel gut level about that story, or excited? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a very bittersweet, high variance world we're moving into. So there's things I'm both worried about and very excited about. So, if you think back to 2022 when ChatGPT was first released, there was, early into 2023, a flood of submissions to like online sci-fi journals, and then a flood of fake answers, AI generated answers to Stack Overflow, and all these things where there was an assumption that, being a human that could generate coherent text was some kind of barrier to entry that was sufficient, like that failed, and suddenly you had a kind of distributed denial of service attack, and this was sort of manageable because it was just text, it's just slop, and I think, but we can sort of extrapolate from that, what happens, those same dynamics play out, but in realms that where the barrier to entry is some modicum of autonomy and agency. And this is where I think things get a little crazy, because it's not just one person generating an answer to Stack Overflow, but bot farms filing every potential grievance or motion or lawsuit, submitting millions of very coherent and unique public comments on new regulations. Even in the private sector, Sam Altman once was on a panel and asked about, what is the use for this is shortly after they released Operator, their first AI agent, computer use agent. And he sort of took a sideswipe at Google, who had just revealed something similar and demoed, using their AI to book a restaurant reservation. And he said, well, no, the purpose of an agent is not to go book a restaurant reservation for you. It's to call 500 restaurants, the best restaurants in the city, find the exact best time and place, and then book that reservation. Now, obviously, if you're using OpenTable, or if those restaurants are then pushed to adopt, AI customer service answering agents, then that all works.
Solve for the equilibrium, right?
Yeah, you solve for the equilibrium. And this is another reason why diffusion ends up being faster than people realize, just because it may only take like 1% of the population using AI in that way for every restaurant's phone to always be ringing, and to drive that general equilibrium outcome.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that. You mentioned filing suits. So I do want to talk about what happens to the courts. Seems important, right? So on one hand, like you say, cheaper to litigate and to, I don't know, just generate denial of service attacks against your adversary effectively, right? If you just have free, unlimited lawyers. On the other hand, presumably the courts themselves can get more efficient at processing suits, and settlement becomes easier, more efficient. I don't know, how does that net out in your mind? Like, on aggregate, are the courts going to get totally jammed up?
Yeah, I mean, my expectation is in aggregate, in the limits, we move to some entirely new system. But in the interim, I don't think it is an open question, because it's not just like, in many areas of econ, there are things like, where there's an unambiguous effect on, supply curve moves out, demand curves moves out. And then there's many things where the effect is ambiguous. I think this is a scenario where the effect is pretty ambiguous, but if you add in a little bit of empirical content about what we know about how our core systems already function, right? We know that there are already massive backlogs in most U.S. courts. If you look, don't even talk about like immigration courts. This has been the long-standing fight to try to get more money for like asylee processing. and I also don't want distributed denial of service attack, that metaphor, to be interpreted as something that's inherently malicious. Like, I think a lot of this is actually just appropriate use of AI at unprecedented scale and into institutions that have not adapted to the new throughput demand that will be put on them, right? And already we have technologies like, whisper transcription that is probably as good or better than human stenographer, and yet courts still use human stenographers. And a lot of these processes are baked into the way the legal system just simply works. There have been a few countries that have trialed AI adjudication in court cases. So Taiwan famously has been piloting the use of AI in simple fraud and, I believe, DUI style cases. They're pretty, forward thinking in that sense. But my modal expectation is that the whole system gets flooded. It becomes very difficult to triage, and people start moving towards sort of privatized solutions. And this goes back to your earlier point, is where, AI also provides new methods of adjudication, of private arbitration, not just sort of for the existing demand that we have for law, but like totally new levels of, inter-firm commercial contracting, where, you could have two AI native firms that are mostly or fully run by teams of AI agents. They're contracting with other firms, adjudicating disputes, thousands of them a minute or something like that, in ways that courts can never actually handle.
I don't know if it's a trite point, but there's all this kind of law and economic stuff where, like, in theory, in civil suits, you should just never actually go to court, right? Because it's costly for both of you. And then that notably doesn't always happen in the real world, but maybe it happens. Like, we get closer to the kind of the theory in this AI world, where it's just incredibly cheap to just find these settlements and like just sue each other constantly and like settle constantly. And maybe this is like in some way kind of efficient or more efficient overall.
And we do this already, right? We do this already, like Amazon, eBay, YouTube's takedown system for copyright. These are kinds of parallel quasi-legal institutions, right? And in fact, like the DMCA takedown system that YouTube uses was emerged out of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that was, the kind of far-sighted congressional action, which delegated the ability for platforms to do that kind of takedown.
Yeah, maybe that connects kind of nicely to this bigger question about what happens to legislation and writing laws. So you have this paper with Justin Bullock and Seb Creer. Am I remembering that right?
Mm-hmm.
AGI governments and free societies. Yeah, do you want to say where that came from? Why you wrote it?
Yeah, so I originally wrote the AI Leviathan series, and that paper grew out of that as a more academic version of the same arguments for a collected volume.
One point in that paper is that laws today are written with the expectation that they're imperfectly enforced, right? Because you're never going to be able to monitor everyone for every possible breach of a law, and you can kind of use your discretion as a law enforcement officer or agency. That could change because it could get much cheaper to perfectly enforce the text of a law, right? Because monitoring gets a lot cheaper. Yeah, what follows from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the upshot is that we need a kind of regulatory or legal jubilee and just sort of try to reset, recalibrate laws to the new level of potential enforcement. So, on the one hand, there's a world in which, existing laws perfectly enforced would just be totalitarian, right? There's the famous book, 3 felonies a month or something like that, or 3 felonies a day, I forget which, where arguably, at least in the United States, we may be committing 3 felonies a day, even if it's 3 felonies a month. It just takes one. So, but those mostly just go unenforced because no one knows and no one can tell, and the law is also very opaque. A world where enforcement dramatically increases is not necessarily a world where there's like this one thing like the enforcement agency and they're just getting all these new powers. It's also the way in which AI is diffusing in the economy. So take something like self-driving cars. Back, I think in 2022, 2023, I forget exactly when Tesla rolled out one of their first full self-driving models. It was doing this is when they transitioned from to the full end-to-end neural network, just trained on their Dojo driver data. The cars began performing rolling stops. Why? Because they're trained on human data, and most humans, 2 in the morning when the intersection's clear, don't fully stop at the stop sign. Now, the law is written that rolling stops are illegal, but not because they're always bad, just like jaywalking isn't always bad. It's just that the police need the ability to enforce the edge cases. But when that model was pushed out, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration issued an immediate recall, right, for the entire fleet, because the entire fleet has monitoring on board, right? And so I've sometimes called this the sort of legibility arms race, where there's elements of our society that are going to get vastly more legible, even as other parts of the society get vastly less legible because of deepfakes and just the sort of schizophrenic way in which the world will appear.
I was reading people just started like putting traffic cones on the trunks of self-driving cars or just sitting on the trunk, and this will just disable it. Like it's not going to drive when a human is sitting on it. Now, why can you do this to a self-driving car and not to a human-driven car? It's because, 1 in 20 humans are going to get taked off enough to like press down the accelerator, right? And because the reputational harm of a self-driving car doing anything like that just gets diffused across like all of its instances, the entire company, they're going to be like incredibly risk averse in this way, and so like very exploitable by bad faith actors or something like this. I don't know if that relates in your mind, but it feels
no.
Feels
I think it's a real thing. This is why we can't have nice things. There's I think this is also a way in which like culture will be a binding constraint on diffusion. So when I was doing tech policy like 5-6 years ago, everyone was talking about Internet of Things, delivery drones. We're on the cusp of like, the internet being in the roads and stuff like that. And that never really panned out, at least in the United States. It's panned out in Shanghai. And why is that? Well, because they have, first of all, the coordination externalities, the political coordination ability to sort of get everyone on the same protocol. And then they also have different cultural expectations where, I think this is just my projection, but I think there are fewer people in China lighting Waymos on fire during protests. and so this also militates towards privatization insofar as, you can imagine, at some point gated cities or gated communities that have dedicated lanes or very strict monitoring of people who step in front of a Waymo to exploit the fact that they know it will break.
Yeah, that could be cultural, right? It could also have to do with the penalties for lighting a Waymo on fire, or the expected penalty, where like if you're just more draconian as a state,
yeah,
then it's going to be just a really bad idea.
I think it's clearly both. Like, when I was in Germany, I didn't pay the fare on the train because I couldn't figure it out. And no one said anything.
Nice.
But I think Germany has a reputation for people, stopping at the stop sign even when there's no traffic.
Okay, backing up, like there's this idea that laws are much cheaper to perfectly enforce, and so you get something like a legibility arms race. Part of me just feels a bit skeptical because, if I'm a legislator or I'm an enforcement agency, and everyone sees that like, I'm writing laws or enforcing laws in a way that they get like perfectly enforced in these kind of crazy and obviously inefficient ways, then wouldn't that just be very unpopular? And so couldn't you just easily kind of tell your like, whatever AIs you have helping out not to perfectly enforce the laws in that way? And, you can sprinkle in some leniency. Like famously, the AIs are not like the AIs of sci-fi from the 20th century. Like they have some kind of common sense understanding. So can't we just kind of rely on that?
Maybe. I think it depends on how robust and efficient your feedback mechanisms are in terms of policy generation and implementation, right? So, many U.S. cities have had terrible housing crises that have spanned decades and produced massive homeless populations. And there are people who know the solution to those things, and yet they don't get implemented. And partly it's due to NIMBYism, partly it's just due to inefficient political processes that have fundamentally broken. So I think it's definitely a lot easier when you're dealing with pure regulation that has already been delegated to an agency that has the discretion to review and amend those regulations. It's a lot harder when it's something that's in statute and requires Congress to get its shit together. And I think a lot of these things will require more firmer level sort of structural reform. It's not just a matter of giving the FDA co-pilots, but rethinking the fundamental drug approval clinical trial process from the ground up. This is another reason why I'm sort of pessimistic about the state moving quickly enough. On the other hand, we have seen examples where that's happening, right? So we have regulatory sandboxes. We have states like Utah, which just approved the first AI that can do medical diagnosis and prescription with no human in the loop. And so there are, this goes back to the jagged frontier. There are spiky areas where this stuff is going to get adopted. It's why I've been bullish on the Trump administration's efforts to review comprehensively federal regulation for their compatibility with AI and autonomy, so that, for instance, we don't inadvertently ban automated crane operators simply because the OSHA regulation didn't foresee that would exist, and so wrote into the law that you have to have a human on site.
There's this idea of regulatory markets rather than, as a regulator, both kind of figuring out what outcomes you want and then figuring out how to implement them by writing all the rules exactly and enforcing them exactly. Instead, you kind of figure out what you want, and then private regulators kind of compete to find the most efficient way to kind of codify and enforce them. Maybe just lawmaking in general and regulation in general, whether or not it will, should head really far in that direction.
Yeah, I think that paper was written in the context of AI regulation specifically, and building a market for like auditing applied more generally, I think it's actually kind of a status quo ante. Like it's a thing that we have in spades already. There are many medical areas that are not regulated by the state, but instead regulated by various medical boards. I already mentioned the example of the origin of stock exchanges was something like this. And then the question is, are there still economies of scale, whereas things move into these more regulatory, quasi-regulated platforms, that there is benefits to everyone being on the same platform, right? And this is partly the theory of two-sided markets, two-sided platforms, like Stripe or like Amazon, etc. And there's a paper, I forget the author's name, but it's called Platform Regulators, that makes the argument that these two-sided platforms have very aligned incentives to producing the sort of Pareto optimal regulatory balance between different stakeholders, because their modus operandi is to maximize the total volume of transactions on their platform. And so they need to balance in a Coasian way the buyer and the seller. And so they grow that total volume. Now, this is like easy to imagine because we already have it in the case of like e-commerce, but why not have this for, tenancy acts? Replace your tenancy acts with like an Airbnb style platform where there's a dynamic regulation between the rights of the tenant and the landlord.
Isn't the point that there are these kind of monopoly powers? So once you've become Airbnb, it's very hard for one side of the platform to defect to the better alternative. So you can just kind of ratchet up extract more and more, pun not intended, rents from your rules. So don't you just get that if you like privatize much more of these areas?
Yeah, you get something more feudal. Right? And the middle way, the middle path maybe looks more, I talk about this in a series, more like Estonia, where you try to maintain a kind of interoperable firmware layer that preserves the openness and competitiveness element that you care about, and allows people to, borrow that distributed ID or borrow, to use the government as an API essentially to have competition between different regulators.
Can you say more about how Estonia works? I don't know anything about it.
Sure. I wrote about this a long time ago in 2015 in an essay called Disrupting Bureaucracy, how software will eat the state, building on the Mark Andreessen Software Eats the World line. Estonia, I always found interesting because they had the first and most advanced e-government. And now partly we're talking about the transition from like human government to AI government. We're sort of skipping the skipping the internet era. But the internet also drove a lot of these transitions, the sort of adoption of like, online tenders and job application systems and things like this, digital ID. Estonia is very early to this, partly because they, in the early 90s, had a blank slate after the fall of the Soviet Union. They had a very young civil service. There's a academic paper I've quoted before that talks about them being full of policy hackers, these young entrepreneurial kids. That Estonia also has a deep sort of bench of software development talent. Obviously, that's where Jan Tallinn and Skype came out of. They have relative to their 1 million population, have a lot of startups. They also used to have and still do, had the Cybernetic Research Institute, which later became Cybernetica, going back to the 50s and 60s. So a lot of the original sort of Soviet cybernetics research came out of Estonia. Anyway, that's all background for the fact that in the 90s, as they were building their first, rebuilding their government sort of from a blank slate, they were very forward thinking with the early internet and building a sort of internet native government. They, through Cybernetica, contracted with this company called a company that built a product called X-Road. X-Road was sort of a predecessor to blockchain. It's a distributed data exchange layer that is fully encrypted. And so basically everything in Estonia is built on this common data exchange layer that has an open API, publicly encrypted. What that means is that if Russia ever bombed their education ministry, that those records are also stored in every other ministry. And so they have one one ID, one card for voting, for riding the bus, for paying taxes. They have the ability to build in lots of automations so that when your birth record is registered for your child, a timer is ticking for when to notify you that they're ready for pre-K. And this has allowed them to have very high rates of state capacity with a relatively minimal human resources footprint. It's also allowed them to integrate with banking, other private services. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of privately provided things that plug into the government through their API.
It sounds great, and it also sounds really, really hard to become more like Estonia if you start from being more like the UK or the US.
Yeah, path dependency is a bitch.
I don't know, like, is there a kind of more incremental path that doesn't involve regime change?
I would hope, I think there is in principle, but at least in the US context, the macro trend has been for, these 70 to 80 year major constitutional resets, punctuated by civil war in the case of Abraham Lincoln, by the Great Depression, World War II, FDR. Often it's just like in machine learning. There's one way you can look at the training loss and see this gradual improvement, and another way where you see things suddenly grok. And the whole point about regime change is that when you have a lot of path dependency, you may need to have like these subnetworks formed that then suddenly grok and become the new default.
I guess there's a model which looks like you have some space for experimentation, and then the experiments which work, you can scale up. And that's not like, big picture regime change in a scary sense. So it could be like, state by state, and then there's kind of copying. Or I don't know the exact story behind. So the UK kind of modernized its like online presence quite a few years ago now. And it's really good. And my sense is that came from a kind of basically quite a small unit that was the result of just commissioned by a minister. And then they just demonstrably did a very good job. And then that could then kind of get scale and replace other things. So I know there's like, if you just turn up the kind of rate of experimentation in government, then that's really the thing you need.
I'd be all for that. This is going continuing to abuse my machine learning metaphor, turning up the learning rate on government. And, that is one model. So, it's often easier to build a parallel system than to reform an existing one and do the kind of Indiana Jones switcheroo. This is what for instance, the Defense Innovation Unit at the DOW is supposed to be vis-a-vis the classic Big Five defense prime contracting process. That process is right now underway where they're trying to scale that process, that alternative pathway up to bring in fresher blood into the defense ecosystem. It's a model that I super support. I think that there are still questions about the kind of horizontal firmware level parts of government where it's very difficult to build these alternatives, and where that alternative growing in parallel looks a lot more like the parallelization of core government functions. We already talked about law. I imagine, what will happen in the National Health Services or what have you when we have, at-home robotic AI doctors that completely sidestep the need to have a public health system. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of kicking and screaming, and so that is the right way forward. That's the better path forward. And I think regime change also looks a lot like that, just everywhere all at once. It's not really that different in kind. It's more different to degree.
Something we haven't talked about yet is democracy, the democratic process, just as one of these core functions of government. People talk about how AI could radically change the democratic process. You have these very high bandwidth kind of modes of input. Frankly, I don't know what to think about that. Yeah, what are some just kind of promising ideas here? Can we just improve on the status quo?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my bias is to see 20th century style social democracy in particular as sort of a technologically contingent aberration. And for the more right-sized, the thing that the attractor that institutions will be pulled towards is something that looks more like I mentioned, sort of techno-feudal, where there's not a ton of direct democracy and voting on things or representative government. but simply producers providing services and being responsive through other kinds of feedback mechanisms, through KPIs, through different sort of cybernetic feedback, and the residual need for some degree of local coordination that leads you into wanting to look more like Singapore than European Commission or something like that.
Why is 20th century, I don't know, Western European liberal democracy, why is that contingent on technology?
I mean, for many reasons. The first we already talked about, which is the ways in which there's just like this U-shaped curve and optimal size and scope of government. Second is the sort of social base, right? Democracy depended on, and this is a very Asimov Will Robinson kind of point, dependent on society, quote unquote, having relatively balanced power with the elite. And where did that power come from? Well, it partly came from like having this robust mercantile class. In the early 20th century, it came from manufacturing and the rise of a bourgeois sort of middle to society. And if that gets hollowed out, or if there's, and we see this again, sort of in micro, like the transition from that middle old liberal sort of Keynesian era into the new neoliberal era was in part a transition to more fragmented worker power, to the era of globalization, where you do have these sort of escape valves to transnational institutions that necessarily usurp some popular sovereignty. And that was driven in part by just technological currents. Right. And so I think there's no way to ever really go back. And then, as we roll the clock forward, I think there are these other more fundamental questions of like, what does democracy even buy you if we can have systems that predict your desires better than you know them yourselves?
Yeah. I mean, okay, like what's the pessimistic story here? Maybe it is as a massively oversimplified story of how you get like 19th, 20th century democracy. You have this like newly empowered kind of bourgeois class as a result of Industrial Revolution. They have some kind of new bargaining power against the like ruling elite. And so like that kind of implies some balance in power. And like not just economic bargaining power, but also the fact that people have guns, for example. And then, okay, why does this become less relevant? Well, you get this like hyper inequality future, maybe, where you do go back to having, at least economically speaking, like a kind of super elite class, right? And then, the underclass, even within rich countries, for like reasons that have been discussed elsewhere. And so that kind of bargaining story doesn't work anymore. There's a question of other kinds of threats that just give you leverage that aren't economic, like aren't the fact that like my labor is useful. And then the result is just, okay, like whatever governing institutions exist in like this kind of hyper unequal 2050 world, they just have no reason, incentive-wise, to care about almost everyone. And like maybe almost everyone, materially speaking, have like pretty good lives, right? Because this is just such a wealthy world overall. But I just don't feel good about it. Like it feels like pretty cold comfort that like almost everyone is politically marginalized, but gets to like be marginalized with like, the iPhone 20. And does that story seem realistic? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, we shouldn't overstate the ways in which we are already democratic. Like I think democracy is this pretense that we can do to collective decision making. It doesn't seem to have ever really worked. Maybe the Swiss cantons come the closest. But what we have instead, and what really quickly transpired in the 20th century, was this transition from, smaller republicanism in the US context to a kind of managed democracy, where, Charles C. Wright wrote this famous book called The Power Elite maybe in the 40s, early 50s, where he observed this emergence post-industrial revolution of this new sort of industrial organization of society, where we had once been a sort of craft and agrarian economy that was very distributed, and suddenly we had these mega corporations, 100 odd corporations that ran whole entire sectors: energy, agriculture, chemicals, etc. And he noticed that within these companies, there was a managerial and ownership class that was deeply interconnected. They often sat on each other's boards. They went to the same social clubs. They donated to the different parties, but they were the class that was running the party. And so we have this sort of pretense of democracy, but actually there's a kind of selectorate that sits on top of society, built on top of that modern managerial social base. I think that's the world we inherited, right? It's the world that also gave us the European common market. It's the world that is in Davos right now for the World Economic Forum. This is the democracy that we're leaving behind. And so, like, I can easily see this pattern playing out again, but on steroids, where people who are very early to AI that are heavily invested in companies like NVIDIA or the Mag 7 hyperscalers, and many of the new startups that will, OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera, scale. You zoom out, you look at this class of people. There are a lot of tight social networks, right? How many companies has Daniel Gross and Nat Friedman invested in? right, and or Patrick Collison or whomever. And these people, this new burgeoning class is another reason why we should expect some kind of regime change is because they are emerging from a different power center in U.S. society. I'm speaking in a very U.S. centric way, but 20th century, our politics in the U.S. was dominated by the New England's northeastern elites, like centered around Wall Street, and the sort of Republican elite centered around, the South and really, the energy markets in West Texas. And so you get sort of either Jamie Dimon or Rex Tillerson as your stereotypical power broker. Silicon Valley, has been around for decades, but really only sort of crossed that threshold of having independent political power, I think, this last election cycle, before they were sort of a swing vote. And now that they're building new, not just, apps and sort of sideshow technologies, they're building like core infrastructure that will power the post-AGI world. I could easily see Stripe being the platform for like agentic commerce, where most agents are transacting on their network. And that de facto turns Patrick Collison into like the John D. Rockefeller of our era. And that will necessarily have influence on the shape and feel and look of our political system.
I want to ask you about Taiwan, where it seems like people talk about these kind of interesting experiments in democracy. There's this like Gov0.
Audrey Tang kind of stuff.
Audrey Tang, exactly. My impression of it as an outsider is you can do participatory democracy and more like direct democracy that actually kind of works now, because the AIs can just like intermediate and can like aggregate all this information and process it and like deliver the bottom line to whoever needs to see it. And that suggests like a different direction where at least democratic inputs are, higher bandwidth. Like you can get listened to more regularly and in more detail. Like maybe that's compatible with the story that we've just been talking about, but
I think it's directionally more similar to like my vision for Estonia, and so like the Audrey Tangs of the world, the Glenn Wiles of the world. I think they are thinking at least at the right order of magnitude of system design. That's just tweaking things on the margin. They're trying to think of the new equilibrium. Whereas, maybe like a Balaji Srinivasan with his network states is also thinking at the right order of magnitude, but in the more libertarian neo-feudal direction or competitive corporate jurisdictions direction. and I think there's probably going to just be some mix of these, right? Just like we have in the world today. We have small d democracies, and we have Gulf state monarchies. We have Estonia. We have the United Kingdom. We have Hungary. I think there's going to be a lot of variety in the world still. In some ways, my expectation is that the variety will increase exponentially, because we won't need to be as joined at the hip because these economies of scale are kind of collapsing.
What do you mean by that last thing you said?
So one of the reasons we got big states in the Enlightenment era was through this sort of Napoleonic economizing and transaction costs, where we went from having 150 different dialects of French and equally diverse numbers, units of measurement, to having, the metric system and standard French. And there's a way in which AI can provide a kind of codex translation layer so that your meter is different than my meter, right? And that unravels the need to have these large collective decision-making bodies. That, by the way, lead to like homogenization and the things that people associate with the sort of downsides of modernity.
Maybe a pushback on that is, even if you get initially more variety between governments, you also, because everything is moving faster, you get just more hardcore selection between different kind of configurations, where maybe very shortly after, the world is just dominated by, for example, whatever form of government gets the highest growth or something like this.
Yeah, totally.
Well, we can't really choose that, unfortunately. And it also feels very hard to stop. So maybe it's like a very brief period of kind of exciting variety and experimentation, followed by the like Molochian conclusion.
Yeah, well, the grokking I mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is one reason why I focus so much of my attention on U.S. competitiveness vis-a-vis China, because I do think there's a world in which like we kind of fragment and unravel, and China remains this kind of Han civilization meta-organism that has the best of both worlds and has the economies of scale to gobble up the world. So it'd be nice to have at least a comparable power block to balance that. On a more micro scale, I think it depends on the kind of balance of offense and defense of this technology, right? And so people often will try to point to the defense dominant aspects of AI as a positive, and I think they can be very positive, but they also have trade-offs. So the abilities of the Houthis to shut down the Red Sea or the Suez Canal or whatever, or the ability for that's making use of the defense dominant elements of like drones, right? If we had a Waco, Texas, or a Ruby Ridge sort of sovereignty autonomous zone movement that had killer drones and high tech counter surveillance and things like that, might be a porcupine that would be difficult for a larger state to just bring black helicopters in and disrupt.
Some paper that I haven't read about how the defense-offense balance scales in general with like the technology level, and I think it's trying to argue that it shifts towards defense for some reason.
Well, I think a lot of this is just cope, right? Like a lot of this is copium. Same with like this, democracy stuff. Like, I think people are they're trying to think outside the box, but only on certain margins, and failing to see the ways in which everything is going to change. And that this vision of like a kind of citizen assembly doesn't even make sense. We're we're in a world where these collective action problems can just be solved by the AI for us, where there be many fewer of these collective action problems in the first place because we won't be so interdependent.
There's an attitude you can take, which is just cynical about anything changing or any kind of alternative to the status quo being feasible. And that's not right. Like, things will, at least in your view, change quite a lot. By default, the kind of, possibility space is larger than a lot of people are just going to naturally imagine. And like somehow you need to be able to like contemplate very, very, like potentially very weird or very different possibilities, but then somehow also be serious about what's feasible and what's not feasible.
Yeah. And, and one intuition I have, and sort of cuts across everything we've been discussing, is that like the modern regulatory state is to the future government, that like the future regime, as like good old fashioned AI is to deep learning, right? Like regulatory codes, rulemaking processes. These are the good old fashioned AI way of regulating things. They are algebraic. They're formally verifiable. But they're also incredibly brittle and don't generalize very well, and we overfit to them. I think there'll be, proliferation of different regime types, but I think the thing that they'll have to have in common is that they're more grown than designed.
That makes it hard to reason about them in advance, right? But that's how the world is, then so it goes. I want to ask you about just how you think about policy. So my sense is that you have this kind of classical liberal / libertarian background. I think you're a kind of moral pluralist in some sense, in ways at least that this kind of AI safety kind of EA sphere doesn't have quite so much of. And I want to know, like how do you see your own views as different from that kind of blob?
I don't want to stress the disagreements too much because there's a lot of common affinity. And I think if, the thing about moral pluralism is that there's a lot of different moral perspectives that all lead towards not killing everybody. So, I am kind of partial to like more long-termist ways of viewing the world. I think there's a kind of category error that a lot of EAs make, and just in terms of like what morality is and what it's for. I think of the propositional side of morality, the things we write down as our moral precepts and principles, as not doing really much work. I think of that as more just like the explication of norms and principles that are implicit in our social practices. And that the reason we get cultural and moral evolution is because these norms first emerge implicitly in practice, and this is what makes them binding, right? This is what drives behavior and drives motivation, is the fact that you recognize a norm as something that you're committed to. But then once we are able to articulate that norm using language, it becomes this thing that's separate from us that we can critique and reflect on, but also led in the Enlightenment era to this sort of modern Euthyphro dilemma of like does the morality, is right and wrong true or false because of like the arguments of Derek Parfit, or is Derek Parfit right or wrong because that's what morality is? And I think it's just what I see in EAs and among utilitarians is still this attachment to a kind of analytical, logical, positivist tradition that thinks that morality is this propositional thing that we can reason about, rather than that those propositions just being byproducts of things that are antecedent in social practices. And this leads to certain pathologies, right? Charles Taylor is a big influence on me, the Canadian philosopher, and he has a great essay called, I think it's called Deep Diversity, where he talks about sort of his critique of utilitarianism, this push to reify one terminal value, and that this is again sort of falls out of this moral category error. Yeah, so I guess I'm almost like a cultural relativist. Only I don't like that term because it sort of falls prey to this sense that there's this like outside view that these different cultures are all on equal footing, whereas I am embedded. I'm more of a Kantian constructivist or something like that, where morality is emergent out of social conventions, and I'm inextricably bound to certain norms and because of like antecedent commitments that shape my behavior.
So you can totally accept, right, that you or I have inherited norms, attitudes that have been shaped by forces beyond my awareness or control. Still, it seems like it's possible to kind of take stock of the things that I seem to care about and then notice where they seem to be like, incoherent or inconsistent, or they can be improved upon somehow, right? And you can kind of iterate a little bit in that way. And there's a question of whether that process gets you all the way to this kind of, like monomaniacal theory that you can like write down in 3 lines. Right. But like, surely there is a process that gets you some way towards being like, for example, a bit more consistent. It's not clear to me if you're like a full relativist, if you can make sense of that. So I don't know what word there is for this, but there's like a way to improve somehow.
Yeah, I like to start with like a more descriptive lens on sort of like the sociology of morality, where it comes from. The different lenses on this. There's one famous way of approaching it is that there are morality divides into the pre-conventional, the conventional, and the post-conventional. And so pre-conventional are just you're an 11th century peasant and you just adopt the norms of the people around you, or maybe your tribal society or something like that. Conventional is when these things transcend into being sort of like etiquette and explicit forms of convention that are passed down generation to generation. And post-conventional emerges with the sort of Enlightenment era, where we can reflect upon our conventions and critique them as being inconsistent with other beliefs or not purely rational. Why do we wear ties? This is just some archaic thing that came from like having a bib. And this ties into like, I think Hegel and how Hegel understood the evolution of culture. Kant and Hegel are in this kind of conversation with each other, where Kant is sort of seeing these sort of pure formalism, right? And Hegel called it, in his critique of Kant, empty formalism, that we can just sort of abstract the categorical imperative free from any content. And Hegel, in my interpretation, his project is really trying to socialize Kant, to naturalize Kant back into actual existing social practices that imbue morality with its content. Sort of post-Hegelian thinkers like Habermas have their theory of discourse ethics, which I'm also a fan of. And there's an essay by Joseph Heath that people are interested called Rebooting Discourse Ethics, which I think does a good job of explaining, going to the heart of your question, which gets at this observation, this character of moral development towards quote unquote good morality from bad morality, namely morality that is more universalizable, more prospective, more consistent across cases. And Habermas's theory, which I think is actually sort of built on a Hegelian theory, is that this comes out of the structure of language and the role of language in cultural reproduction. So going back to my earlier point that these norms begin as practices that are as commitments that are implicit in practice, and only later do we articulate them in language. But once they're articulable in language, what that is doing functionally is transforming an imperative, do this, don't do that, into an assertion. You ought to do this, you ought to do that. And this makes it something that feels freestanding. It feels like it takes on the kind of conditions of validity of other assertions, as if there is some oughtness in the world to which it must correspond. It also has a tendency to make our norms more universal. This adds a sort of pragmatic bias to the structure of cultural evolution to become more universalizable over time. Our normative commitments become more universalizable over time. Now, I think it's an added step to say that this is necessarily like there's some outside view that says this is a good versus bad morality, that we're trending towards something that's more right. I think it's actually just a byproduct of how language shapes culture.
Say I'm thinking about all the stuff we've talked about, doing some kind of AI governance thinking or whatever. Who else should I be reading? Like, you're very well read. You've talked about like Hegel and Habermas, which is pretty rare for most AI governance conversations. Joseph Heath too, you mentioned. Anyone else?
I'm also a big fan of Yasha Bach, the computer scientist, now runs the Machine Consciousness Research Institute or something like that. I think he has by far the best grasp on what consciousness is. The political realm, I'm a big fan of books like Dominic Cummings. Joseph Heath is my senpai, though. Everyone should read more Heath.
Where do you start with Joseph Heath?
Depends what you're interested in. The book that I started with as a kid is a book called The Rebel Cell. It's also sold as A Nation of Rebels. And it's written with Andrew Potter. That's a critique of the New Left, sort of cultural Marxism from the left, from a social sort of old Fabian left perspective. And it makes the argument that, beginning with, the 68ers and the kind of Marcuse sort of Freudian Marxist fusion, that this idea that, social norms are repressive and they repress our libidinal instincts, and our id wants us to get out, and really like wearing a suit and tie is equivalent to fascism, and living in the suburbs is equivalent to fascism. And so we need to then lean into being sort of cultural rebels to subvert the culture. And this will also, fights consumerism and these other bads. And they point out that actually this merely drives the cycle of fashion and social distinction, where what people really care about when it comes to like looking cool is a kind of social distinctiveness. And these things, and social distinctiveness is inherently positional and zero sum. And so, it starts out that everyone wants to be punk, and then eventually punk becomes mainstream, and you got Green Day and these other pop punk bands, and then punk is no longer cool anymore, so you need to shift into something else. And this becomes the fuel for consumerism rather than its antinomy. And so they step away from that and say, well, actually, what's going on is that we need to understand the way in which conspicuous consumption and Veblen goods and these things are part of a collective action problem. And the way you solve that is by taxing advertising or something like that. and it's not if you want to solve the climate, it's not like embracing a deep ecology and going to your community garden. It's like taxing carbon and these sort of superficial things that solve for the misaligned incentives. And that got me really into economics as a kid. So The Rebel Cell is a great starting point. It's a fun book. It's sort of culturally still very relevant. I think you can also, it was written in the early 2000s, but it's sort of interesting lens on which to see the new right and the emergence of a kind of countercultural right as recapitulating these same trends. My favorite work of philosophy of his is called Following the Rules, which is his defense of a sort of this more pragmatic deontic approach to morality. That's synthesizing Habermas. Robert Brandom is another name that I should have mentioned. Robert Brandom, the neo-Hegelian pragmatist philosopher. And then from it comes to public administration and government, he has a great book called The Machinery of Government, which is an examination of the sort of implicit normative foundations of public administration.
That was great. Thanks. Let me wildly switch topic. You visited the UAE recently and you read about it. Yeah, what's your sense of their stance on AI? Do they seem, totally AGI pilled? Does it seem like they're going to kind of fall in line with the US or play more neutral? What's going on there?
Yeah, I think they're arguably the most AGI pilled country on earth. I think they're still probably less AGI pilled than you and me, but very far in terms of governments. They will be the site of a 5 gigawatt cluster overseen by Oracle, OpenAI, NVIDIA. OpenAI gets 1 gigawatt of that for Stargate, UAE. I think when that's completed, it will be one of the single largest clusters in the world. And this is in a small Gulf country citizen population of 1.4 million. Their total population is a little over 10 million, but the rest are all expats, guest workers. UAE is centered around two major cities, Abu Dhabi, the capital, and Dubai. And then they have other smaller emirates. And so it's managed in a quasi decentralized way. It's not like a Gulf monarchy like Saudi Arabia. It's more like this. The term that they used, that the one of the foreign ministers we met used, was inclusive representative tribal system. But they are infatuated.
An alternative to luxury automated space communism.
Right. But they are closer to this. One of the things I write in Aeon Leviathan is that that in some ways the Gulf monarchies are kind of right sized for a post-AGI world. And the reason for that is they already have some of the adaptive sort of pressures on them as post-scarcity societies, where they have a spigot of oil that lets them basically have everything they want. If you're a citizen, you basically could be a welfare queen. They import guest workers that are functionally like robots from their point of view to build mega projects in the desert. And so they have a lot of the institutional adaptations already in place. They are much more vertically integrated. So if you go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi, there's very little crime, immaculately clean cities. Even the old Dubai, which is basically a bunch of Indian souk style markets, are kind of spotless. They have, the Dubai Future Foundation think tank, which is their in-house think tank, is constantly doing these mini experimentations that we talked about, like piloting delivery robots and figuring out ways to improve the city. They have a very integrated e-government. When COVID happened, they avoided shutdown. I think Dubai was shut down for 5 or 6 weeks, but otherwise reopened. They had obviously a very restrictive sort of vaccine passport system because they are functionally a surveillance state. But in practice, it was, you had much more freedom living in Dubai relative to other parts of the world.
Yeah, I guess if you're a citizen or a tourist, I'd imagine the conditions are pretty different for like guest workers. Maybe I'm wrong.
They're better than others. So, Qatar is pretty bad. I think Saudi's somewhere in between. The political culture in UAE is very westernized, and they're fighting proxy wars in Africa over this. They are forces for a more secular, liberal, Enlightenment orientation to Islam, where it almost, I didn't hear Islam really mentioned once at all. The one time I heard it mentioned was in this conversation with one of their digital ministers, who brought up the fact that the Islamic Caliphate at the time of the printing revolution banned the printing press, the Ottomans, and so on, and that this set back, the Arab Enlightenment dramatically. And he joked that it was because of the bootlegger Baptist coalition between the calligraphers and the government, that the calligraphers didn't want to lose their job to the printing press. And so they're very forward thinking. They do have a lot of guest workers. If you lose your sponsorship or you lose your employment, you can be kicked out of the country pretty quickly. They've had cases of, I think there were 2 British tourists who had sex on the beach and were in prison for 4 months because of their morality laws. So as long as you stay good on their morality laws, you'll be basically fine. And their guest workers are not like other countries where they'll like take your passport or whatever. It's much more. It's still not full citizenship, but it's not as coercive as other places.
How contingent is it that they seem so AGI pilled and they're planning on building these huge clusters? Is it just the leadership, happened to get to kind of read the right blogs a few years ago? Or is this a more structural story?
Someone high in their leadership, I can't remember if it was the one of the sheiks. A lot of them are very into chess. Right, this is another thing. When you basically live in a post-crisis society, you play a lot of chess. And when AlphaZero and AlphaGo came out in, I guess, 2017, that was a wake-up call for them. And then they also had, I think Elon Musk, they referenced Elon Musk gave a major speech around then talking about AI, AGI, and that also woke them up. And so when you go to UAE, you'll notice a lot of the companies are called something 42. So G42 is their big cloud company that's overseeing the Stargate UAE. They have Core 42 is their sovereign cloud, M42, MGX. M42 is their bio project. They're doing an Emirati genome project. The 42 is a reference to Douglas Adams. And so, so they're very like Elon aligned on that stuff. And then the structural reason is that they want to diversify, and this is common to Saudi as well.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good question, but okay, like to the extent that the UAE or the Gulf states are well adapted to AGI or just resemble like the kind of attractor for many governments post-AGI, right? Which is this kind of post-scarcity, much more unequal condition. What do you feel about that? Like, I gotta say, I feel pretty conflicted. Like, my sense is that visiting as a tourist, or if you're a citizen, like things are pretty good, but like that doesn't really make me feel unreservedly excited about the world resembling the UAE. I don't know, like what comes to mind there?
Yeah, so let me abstract it a little bit. I already mentioned I see a kind of continuity between corporations and governments, and I think there are ways you can map different corporate governance models to different political regime types. If you think of you can think of democracy, modern democracy, as in many ways like a membership cooperative, right? You have certain entitlements as a member, qua citizen of your country. You get certain, pension obligations, etc. And you also get one man, one vote. So we don't have like pure, syndicalist style, like thick democracies. We have basically these scaled up mutual insurance cooperatives with an army, right? The famous econ quote that modern countries are just insurance companies with an army. then you also have, classical corporate governance, where you have shareholder class, and then you have, which are the residual claimants. They're the de facto owners of the company. And then you have a contracted class. These could be the CEO, it could be the managers, it could be the W-2 employees. And that's much closer to what these Gulf style countries are like. They have the the Emirati tribes formed a sort of limited partnership in the I think 1971 or 73 is when they incorporated, so to speak. And they began as limited partnerships, a lot like a law firm, right, where these tribes came together and formed one entity. But like a lot of law firms, you start with the partners, and the partners then start, so it starts as this co-equal partnership, but then they start growing and they hire associates, they hire paralegals, they hire receptionists, and these are all contracted. Their relationship to the firm is as a contract employee. And that's very similar to the UAE, where they have this ownership class, and then your entitlements as a worker or expat there are much more similar to contract labor. And I don't think there's really a good or bad. These are just different organizational types. And the question is, would you rather live in a society where you got one vote but died of a pandemic?
You know some things about the Mormons. My sense is that they are very successful, at least given their numbers, in terms of wealth, influence. What's the explanation?
Yeah, so my interest in the Mormons goes back to my interest in social welfare and origins of states and things like that. So my my academic work before moving into policy was on econ of religion and the decline of religion, the trend in secularization, and modeling religions. In econ, we model religions as providers of club goods. And so then the question becomes, what was the good that they provided that then got crowded out? And prototypically, religious congregations provided a kind of proto form of social insurance. And like other insurance pools, they have this problem of free riders and limited commitment. So you don't want someone who just comes to church when they're sick. You want someone who comes to church and tithes all the time, so that your insurance pool doesn't unravel. And what happened in the 19th and 20th century was the emergence of first commercial insurance crowded out and competed away mutual aid societies. But then those large insurance networks had their own market failure problems, adverse selection, and so on, which led to sort of unraveling, and then had to be renationalized with state welfare programs. And then this begins the kind of story of crowd out. But the Mormons always stood out as an exception to this. Why did the Mormon faith remain strong as the mainline church and other parts of Christendom withered away? And one of the reasons goes back to the ways in which they adapted their institutions to the New Deal. During the New Deal era, when FDR was passing, all these, really experimenting, throwing everything at the wall, passing these new programs, the church established a church security committee, which studied the problem of, the depression, of people out of work, so on and so forth, and then tried to integrate and build parallel systems to what was being built in the New Deal. So they had their own parallel work relief programs. And in fact, Henry Hopkins, the famous New Dealer, credited work relief to Brigham Young, like with the WPA and the CCC. And so they built these parallel system institutions. They built, cooperative agricultural boards that could pull down money from the predecessor to the USDA that was being established in the New Deal to support, agricultural prices and so forth, to channel that funding into Mormon cooperative farms. And anyway, if you roll that story forward, they end up building this kind of parallel set of institutions, which, going back to, if a nation state is just a mutual insurance company with an army, they are kind of a mutual insurance company with a religion. And they even have, because they're so international now, they have, churches and wards and stakes in almost every country on earth. They have their own diplomatic cable system. Right. And awesome. So, I think it's interesting if the state ever collapsed, that I think the Mormons would still be standing. If you want my like true feeling of like going back to the question of like UAE and feudalism and so forth, my instincts are much more social democratic. Like I would much rather be part of this mutualist sort of set of organizations than one that's purely hierarchical and corporate. And this is where I think the Mormon and LDS faith provides this kind of middle path, where they're voluntarist, and yet they're not. They have a reputation for being on the right. They, have like people like Glenn Beck and Mike Lee. They tend to be very into free markets and so on. But functionally, the Mormon Church is actually much more mutualist, or they have a cooperative ethic.
Yeah, it's super interesting. My question is, how much does that depend on the religious part rather than just it happens to be a high trust community? Could you, in principle, replicate this without all the scripture and the spiritual belief? Like, in some sense, I feel drawn to these communities, but I'm just not going to be able to honestly become a member, right? Because I just don't share those beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, and partly this is like this long-standing question since the Enlightenment: can we sort of have our cake and eat it too vis-a-vis religion? Can we have a secular religion that has all the same qualities and doesn't lead to malaise and shirking and things like that? There's a famous paper in Econ of Religion called Strict Churches Grow Faster that correlates the strictness of the religious doctrine to the commitment of members, and therefore to the retention and growth of the community. New religions like Jehovah's Witnesses prohibit blood transfusion based on one little throwaway line in Leviticus that says the blood is sacred. And this is a very costly signal of commitment. To believe that and to be a member, you actually bear pretty high costs, and so that filters for commitment. And so I think these things probably are inseparable. Whether they have to be transcendent or supernatural is another question. And there have been attempts to build sort of secular religions. Obviously, a lot of these emerge out of Berkeley. Right? There's a deep parallel.
Yeah.
The effective altruist alone. Do you know where the word altruism comes from?
I actually don't know.
Auguste Comte, the positive sociologist in France, in Enlightenment France, founded a secular religion called the Religion of Humanity. That the goal was to be a sort of anti-clerical alternative to Christianity that kept all the good parts and get rid of all the superstition. And they were called the altruists. It was a neologism that he coined. They would wear robes that were buttoned from the back because you had to have someone selflessly help you put it on. And they were extolled.
Taking notes.
Yeah, they were extolled to go into the press and write op-eds for malaria bed nets or whatever the cause was of the day. So they were sort of the proto EAs. And this is part of my inspires part of my claim that EAs are just a kind of secularized Christian virtue ethicists that are recycling a lot of these, in this case, French Enlightenment attempts to build a secular alternative to Christianity. They haven't worked thus far. The ones that have worked via the point of a gun, right? Like the secular alternative to the church was compulsory tax collection, and that really does work. Civic nationalism, secular nationalism, is an alternative, and that does seem to work. There's lots of atheists who believe in, that they root for their team sport. The fact of the matter is these things just haven't proven to be as robust as religious faith, and secularism seems to be a bit, this idea that we're all just going to become secularized has sort of run out. Maybe it's bouncing and Zoomers are becoming more religious. I'm personally an atheist, and it'd be very hard for me to ever, be a believing Christian or something like that, because I don't believe anything supernatural. But this also gives rise to people like Jordan Peterson, who call themselves Christian atheists, and try to retcon a version of Christianity based on like weird pragmatist readings of Genesis.
I saw Richard Dawkins said something along these lines as well.
Yeah, he said he has a soft spot for the Anglican tradition, which I do as well.
Is it kind of a story you can tell about how the kind of post-AGI world is like a more religious world? Where does your head go on that?
Piggybacking on the point about Richard Dawkins, like there's a sense in which Protestantism terminates in atheism, right? That there's that this isn't a break from Protestantism; it's actually its logical conclusion. And with the destruction of the monasteries and so on, the Protestant Reformation drove away the spirits from the forests, right? It moved God into being this abstract love or something like that. And it was a very propositional thing. You believe these sets of propositions, and you go about your life as if the world is basically mechanical. And there's a sense in which AI may be like re-enchanting the world, where it's imbuing agency back into the inanimate and leading to what Joshua Bach has called cyber animism, a kind of post-AGI metaphysics in which we understand spirit is not something that's just ensconced in our heads, but that is suffused throughout any self-organizing complex system. Yasha argues that like the Shintoism in Japan or like the pagan elements of like Northern European Nordic cultures are more sort of fit for purpose for like a post-AGI world, because they don't have this sort of Cartesian dualism baked into their metaphysics.
Yeah, maybe like a more blunt point to make would be something like, today and historically, there are some constraints on what you can get away with believing, and while remaining generally productive and able to like integrate with society. And it's kind of in the wiggle room where maybe most of the action is for the kind of differences between organized religions. But maybe there is just much more wiggle room in the future where it is just less relevant if you're like not as functional in terms of your own labor, because you're not doing the work. And then similarly, it doesn't matter as much that you can't easily communicate or like share most of your worldview with most people, because you have these like alternatives to socializing with society at large. I don't know, maybe that's kind of part of it.
One way to maybe reframe that is that one of the sort of William Jamesy kind of benefits of religion is that it provides for like positive psychology. It provides this kind of social scaffolding to align your lower and higher preferences, and so people who lose religion, they either find alternatives, philosophical, nationalist, that they re-embed into some other normative community that is quasi-religious in certain ways and non-rational in other ways, or they are sort of left adrift and become existential. And so I think on the one hand, there's this sense in which like the true rationalist, if all you cared about was epistemic rationality, you would forego all practical rationality and be the, have true justified beliefs to the point where it starts being a cost on you. So, if you want to make the positive, the sort of the pragmatic case for religion, a lot of it comes down to having this like supportive social scaffolding. And is there a world in which AI begins to substitute for that in a very real way, where, today we have, alcoholic anonymous programs. So, 12-step programs where you're using your peer group to bootstrap your motivation, and religions often mediate that. But could you have your AI Jarvis agent or whatever that is binding you and committing you and providing that servant, being that impartial spectator that aligns your motivation? And what other ways can we embed AI into the physical world, to sort of embodied cognition, embedded in the embedded mind, where we go beyond sort of the Andy Clark Chalmers embedded mind to the embedded will, that we're embedding not just computational capacity into the world, but things that are aligning our agency. And that seems very very promising to me, especially as someone who's very ADHD. Like, once I get over that static friction of like using Claude Code, now I'm building all these like productivity things that are like really helping me.
Okay, great. So we're nearly at time. I have two hopefully very quick fire questions from reading your stuff, and these things stood out. So the first is, you wrote somewhere, explosive growth scenarios imply massive property rights violations. That's not obvious to me. I don't know what you had in mind there.
If we're going to have 30% plus GDP growth, where's it all going? I noticed my dad still has the same dishwasher he's had for 20 years. He still doesn't have a smartphone. There's a lot of people are happy with what they have. And there's some sense in which the existing regulatory framework provides a property right over things. So, this is the point of view of like the more positive, legal positive point of view of rights as a bundle of as property as a bundle of rights. So if you have an HOA or zoning code that says, you can't build houses that are more than 4 stories high, and that gets overturned, in some ways you are altering the property right of the people in that community. And I just see no way in which we're like building Dyson spheres where our property rights are not massively implicitly violated. And that could come through, special economic zones or the weakest link thing that we talked about before, or it could come through a total regime change in the legal order. But it's very hard to squeeze 30% GDP through our existing institutions. And so if that arises, I imagine the institutions have changed dramatically. We also see this like it's the last industrial revolution, like the industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution with rail networks and so on, dependent on major Supreme Court rulings that accelerated the use of eminent domain, right? And if you want to build the Hyperloop or whatever, we can't. There was a project to build a Hyperloop from DC to Baltimore, maybe even further north, and it's very hard to get property owners to agree to that, even though it's underground.
Yeah, like maybe the optimistic story is there's a kind of sense in which eminent domain is something like a skill issue, where in theory you really should be able to work things out efficiently without violating property rights. And it just happens that it's often hard to do that. But the kind of Glenn Wiles of the world, like, they have their ideas about kind of how you might sort these things out. And then if we have AIs to help us do this, maybe like actually it's easier to protect property rights in such cases.
I don't know. I've seen those before and after pictures of Shenzhen, where it was like a small fishing community. I'm sure there was someone there that really liked their waterfront property. Right. And how do you build these cyberpunk cities without implicitly breaking that property right?
You see pictures though as well of the kind of one holdout in a row of high rises or whatever who like didn't sell their lease. And if it's more like that, right, versus, you need a continuous stretch of land to build your rail line or whatever, then the 1 in 100 extremely stubborn people who don't take the, $3 million for their like half-acre plot, that's like probably not a huge bottleneck, right?
No. But I would say even those people have had their rights implicitly violated, right? And insofar as like we've artificially gerrymandered what your property right actually entitles you to for the sake of efficiency, right? And so, when Walmart moves into your community and wipes out Main Street, that's part of a quid pro quo, sort of an underlying rule of recognition of why we have a capitalist society. This is a much more efficient equilibrium. And you can't sue somebody. You used to in the past be able to sue somebody for a competitive tort that they're them opening up a competing store violated your property right. And in some Coasian sense, that's 100% true. But we've carved out market competition as an area where actually your rights don't matter.
Yeah, interesting. Makes me think of these examples with early commercial flight where everyone started complaining about overhead flight lines, and it's like, well, you actually just can't sue anyone, or at least it's undecided whether you own this like hair above your property. Okay, last question you wrote: Terminator analogies are underrated.
I've just been in so many meetings with policymakers or other stakeholders where they're like, AI is going to be great. It's not going to be like the Terminator, like some sci-fi movie. And it's like, it's not even that hard of a sci-fi thing to imagine, right? And I think where I write that, I link to Matt Iglesias's post on this topic where he's like, no, like this is like, we already have humanoid robots. Like we already have.
The world is more futuristic than depicted in the Terminator already, right?
Right. We have these robot dogs where you can easily strap a machine gun to them. And, there was that Black Mirror episode where the 2 robot dogs were like hunting this girl down, or like, Wild Wild West with Will Smith, where the kamikaze, neck drones were coming to like decapitate them. And this is technology that is basically already here, just not evenly distributed.
Sounds right. Okay. On that note, this was great. Sam Hammond, thank you very much.
Thank you.